The 7th episode in Severance's second season is something. Even if you hadn't scoured the internet for potential spoilers and knew it was coming that way, getting a flashback or some other window into Mark and Gemma's marriage before her apparent death seemed necessary. Mark Scout is a man we've only known as someone struggling with grief in the wake of that, and Gemma is a character we've never met who seems almost idealized through the memories and accounts we've had to work with. Since we didn't know her, we had to consider things like nostalgia, selective memory, and the reliability of our primary narrator who spent most of his hours outside of work drinking heavily. In the 2 years since they last saw each other, layers of complications have also come up that affect the current story. That left us guessing a lot, and when that happens, the questions will eventually become too distracting if answers never come. When you consider that the innies know how to get to the testing floor elevator now, Chikhai Bardo feels timely. Episode count aside, we know time is thin as Mark's reintegration progresses and his innie nears completion on the Cold Harbor file. We expect to wrap these things up by the end of the season, so it's now or never to go after that map. And man, wouldn't Herb Sacrifice feel like an incredible waste if they chose never. There's so much I like about this episode, which I found beautiful and haunting in equal measure, that it was hard to decide where to start. I kept coming back to the idea of loss, because the first half of the episode gives us the most precise picture of what was to be lost that we'd had, and the second half fills in the context surrounding what happened. The thing I always connect with loss is the lack of resolution that accompanies the finality of a person's death. Mark touched on this when he described his bargaining last week. You know, the things you wish you'd done differently. Or even if you could go back and change this one thing, then maybe the person you miss would still be there. That's why the scene where he starts breaking down the crib stood out to me. It was set up earlier when Gemma saw the box sitting against the wall and gave her a chance to rib him a little bit, saying he was more handsy than handy, before the episode launches into a color-soaked montage showcasing their idyllic relationship as they tried to conceive their first child. By the time that scene comes up later, the color is gone, and they're in different rooms in a house that's nearly dark, facing something they can't seem to fix. Conflict without resolution. The fertility issues are completely outside their control, and that leaves them each searching for something they can do. The time he spends with the crib ends up with it being broken. Her decision winds up breaking things in ways she could have never imagined, and these are the things a person wishes they'd done differently. The severance of it all is that Mark and Gemma might actually have the chance to try and do that after they're reunited. That and the reality that even though this episode had a bunch of answers, we have accrued an embarrassment of wealth in that regard. The show did what it's been doing all season, maintaining a balance of answering some things while keeping the larger mysteries intact and even expanding them sometimes. And look, I'm not complaining. If you've sat in on my post-recap live discussions, you probably know I'm happy to live in the mystery watching things unfold. The point I'm making here is that I had some questions after watching episode 7, and a few of those were brand new because some of the answers we did get forced me to change some of my ideas about where I thought the show was going, and others were just incomplete. For example, we know Ragabi wasn't wrong, at least not about the part where she said the Gemma Mark knew is still at Lumon on the testing floor. As soon as we saw Dr. Maurer pop up in the background at the fertility clinic, and the cards that Dylan stole from O&D show up in her mailbox, we knew that Lumon preyed on her desperation, and that this would somehow make her a good candidate for their experiment. How she went from saying goodbye to Mark on the night of her accident to living alone on the testing floor is up for debate though, especially since she said goodbye to him in a way that very much made it seem like she planned on coming home, even offering to stay home, which wouldn't make sense if she was in on the plan to disappear. What's even more confounding is that she seems to at least some degree to be a willing participant in what's going on down there up until she hits Dr. Creep over the head with a chair and tries to escape. The thing that stands out is her asking if she'll be able to see Mark after she's been in all the rooms now that the last one, Cold Harbor, is finished. So, questions abound and the list goes on, and I'm really starting to get ahead of myself now. So I'll get to the rest of them as I go through the episode. But about that escape, one question that hangs over everything now. We know she turns into Miss Casey when she takes the elevator to the severed floor. What we don't know is what happens when she takes the next elevator up to the outside world. Ragabi seemed to think that she'd go back to being Gemma and everything would be fine. But I find myself skeptical about that after watching this episode. An escape plan is coming. I feel confident the Macrodats will put that together in the last few episodes. But seeing the investment of time and resources the Egans put into her being on the testing floor, and knowing she plays an essential role in their larger project and how sensitive and completely illegal everything they're doing down there is, I feel like there would be fail-safes in place. Now that I've got that all out of the way, this banger of an episode opens with a flashback to the first time Mark and Gemma met. It happened at Gans College, where they both worked. She sits down next to him to give blood, and the chemistry is unmistakable. You also can't miss the difference in Audi Mark, who is charming and has things together in a way we've never seen in the present-day timeline. After laughing at the title of one of his students' papers, All Quiet on the Western Blunt, she smiles at him in a way which, I don't know. He'd have to be dead for it not to get a response. He then pops the big question, the show's big question anyway, who are you? It sets the stage for a trip through their relationship. When he reaches over to shake her hand, he remembers he's tethered to the line collecting his blood. That leads to a lingering shot of the Lumon symbol on the equipment, which reminds us that they're everywhere and pushes the transition from one timeline to the other. I'm sure people will have a lot to say about how this episode looks. So that I don't have to keep returning to it, let me double down on my assertion that it's beautiful and how impressive that is considering what it's actually about. This is the first episode directed by Jessica Lee Gagné, who has primarily served as the show's director of photography. Since it functions primarily as a departure episode to fill in some blanks and add layers to Gemma's story through flashbacks, it's a perfect opportunity to do things we wouldn't normally expect. Gagné makes the most of this, and her ability to make it feel distinct while navigating through so many different moods without completely abandoning the Severance DNA is remarkable. The transitions are a big part of that, and after we see that Lumon symbol, the focus shifts from that memory to give us our first look at Gemma in the present. She's in a clinical setting. Her hair looks like it did in the flash of the Cold Harbor screen we got in the first episode rather than like Miss Casey's. And even though we can't tell for sure what's going on, unlike the Ortbo that felt borderline unreal, the shock here comes from how hard it is to believe that the same Gemma Mark knew might have ended up on the testing floor. In the introductory scene, they make her real in a way that the show never really could before. Since this follows a flashback, the first thing we hear anyone say in the present day timeline is the nurse, who's played by Sandra Bernhardt in a surprise appearance, asking her, "Where did you go?" The implication is plain. She's daydreaming about when she first met her husband, which gives us our first big reveal that her memories are intact. "Where did you go?" is also the last thing anyone says in the present day timeline and in the episode, when Devin asks Mark the same question after he wakes up at the end. This is a nice little bookend connecting their journeys, and it underlines that the shared space of these memories is where they go in their most trying times. We take a quick trip to the outside world to visit Mark, who is still laid out on his couch. Ragabi says there might be some deficits, but he'll be okay. Devin, who, let's not forget, doesn't even know who this person in her brother's house is justifiably worried. Given that she just watched him have a seizure, she wants to shut down the reintegration as soon as she finds out that that's what they're doing. It makes sense for her to be fiercely protective of her brother, and Ragabi is more focused on what's happening than trying to make her feel better. When she confirms Gemma is still alive, she does get her attention though. Things get more interesting when she brings up the Innie cabin at the birthing retreat later and asks if they could take Mark there to wake up his Innie. This is an explanation of the new plan she said she had in mind at the end of the last episode that she never got to tell Mark about. And it's pretty smart, but Ragabi dismisses it, saying they're totally different things. That's as far as they get into it, but based on what we see on the testing floor, it gives you a better idea of how the severance chips work outside of the the office. Devin suggests that since she's no longer working for Lumon, she could reach out to Harmony Cobell. From her point of view, this makes sense, but Assault tries to make her understand how dedicated Cobell would still be to Lumon even if she's not there anymore. She was raised by them, and if she had info that she could use as leverage to get back on the severed floor, she'd use it. As viewers, we've seen this and know she's right. When Devin tries to call anyway, Ragabi starts packing up her things to leave. It feels abrupt, but she also has reason to fear Cobell getting involved, greater reasons she wouldn't be able to tell Devin about. So when she says it's not her choice, it's Devin's, there's a lot that's unsaid. In my last video, I mentioned being suspicious of Ragabi's true intentions, or at least not knowing what they were. And I don't know that anything we see here has cleared that up. She does appear to care about Mark's health and looks pained to leave him, but that was never really the issue since the reintegration wouldn't matter if he died, and she doesn't come off as someone who's heartless or doesn't see the people she tries to reintegrate as expendable. What this episode did do was to reinforce how real her fear of Lumon is, and that there seems to be an effort to make it hard for us to figure out if she's up to more than just trying to make up for the harm she's done as a Lumon employee. Devin never calls Harmony because while she's agonizing over it, Mark starts to stir and starts talking. He doesn't wake up completely until the end of the episode though, and we don't see Ragabi come back, at least not yet. On the testing floor, the nurse checks on Gemma. She takes her vitals and makes sure she's eating and doing her reading. There's a gadget involved that has Gemma holding an object in each hand while the nurse turns knobs and looks at gauges. Something that obviously doesn't look familiar to me. Then she asks if she were caught in a mudslide, would she be more afraid of suffocating or drowning? This feels like the kind of thing that could come back up, but I'm not sure what we're supposed to take away from it being asked in this situation. You could use it to check on a number of different things, and it's the kind of question that doesn't have a right answer. She answers drowning, which is probably what I would say too, since suffocating at least seems like it might be quicker, and why not cut down on the suffering if both things would kill you just the same? Aside from the slightly strange diagnostics machine and question about fear and dying, this is a pretty standard vital signs check that you might expect from any clinical study. Everything that comes after it is something else. What I like about the way the testing floor is designed is that it's immediately recognizable as a place inside the Lumon building. There's consistency with the severed floor and things like slightly out of this time decor and small things like the signage. But it's also somehow more. The severed floor is a maze of empty hallways, while the testing floor is doors and rooms that feel almost stacked on top of each other. There's more trim, more imposing fluorescent lights, and just more of the Lumon branded uncanniness. The perceived sterility makes sense, but it also gains weight as things progress. You realize there aren't any signs of anyone else on the floor besides Gemma and her nurse. Even when the doctor makes his visits, he comes down in the elevator first. As I've already mentioned, there's no shortage of rooms, and we find out she'll be visiting 6 of them on the first day we spend with her. The testing process involves wearing a wig and putting on a carefully coordinated outfit for each. Gemma seems pensive but compliant, but the cursing under her breath indicates she dislikes what she sees with the first clothing selection. None of this makes sense to us at the beginning, and I'm not sure the dress-up part ever does. But things start to come together as they make their way down the hall. The first door plaque they pass says Allentown, which is a name we recognize right away because we know that this was the name of Mark's freshman fluke file. We see more names, a few of which we saw on the digital Rolodex on his monitor as recently as episode 5, and it feels like we're on the brink of finally understanding what MDR does. Of course, it's not that simple. When they arrive at the door marked Wellington, the nurse activates the security check, which involves a finger prick to check her blood before she can open it. When Gemma crosses the threshold, we see the signature dolly zoom shot to show she's becoming an innie. As things progress, we find out that Gemma's chip is different than the ones the employees on the Severance floor have. Her memories are still spatially dictated, but they're tied to different places. And going into those produces an independent independent innie that only exists there. In the first room, we learn that this particular one only experiences going to the dentist. The practical and commercial applications are readily apparent, and you instantly understand why the Lumon Corporation would be interested in developing this technology. The doctor wheels in the cart with the dental tools that he picked up from O&D in episode 3, still whistling the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald to connect us to where this fits into the timeline. She sheepishly asks for a break because of her fear of seeing him, seeing the tools. For him, it's been 6 weeks since they were last there, and even though he understands this is the only thing she knows, he just says, "I know, nobody likes going to the dentist." Which, as I already pointed out, you can see the commercial applications they can develop from this. Even though his face was concealed in his first appearance, we could figure out from the credits that Robbie Benson was cast in this role. A small detail I really liked is that the first time we see him, he mostly just looks like himself. And that makes each subsequent appearance where his costumes get more outlandish hilarious. It also builds up to the funniest line of the episode when Mr. Drummond flatly asks him why he's wearing that stupid sweater, a question that was going through all of our heads at the same time. Benson does a commendable job of having this creep appropriately sort of ooze all that's gross about his work. He also cranks things up so you can't miss how much he enjoys his job, specifically doing it with Gemma as his test subject, and more specifically, the aforementioned oozing and its effect on her otherwise unsuspecting innies. It's gross. As a recapper following this show since the beginning, I've developed an affinity for the core innies and their plight, so this is just unholy. A new level of corporate depravity where one shouldn't be able to exist. Still, the first indication she acts out against any of this is when Drummond delivers what is probably the second funniest line in the episode, when he asks, "Didn't she break your fingers?" after the doctor tells him Gemma is fond of him as well. When she comes out of Wellington, she turns back into what we would normally call her outie, who experiences some pain in her jaw but has no idea why. She doesn't even know how long she was in there. As she heads down the hall, we get our next big whoa moment when we see a door plaque for Cold Harbor, and she pauses when she notices it too. I mentioned the transitions, and the one here is just a simple dissolve from the file name to Devin watching over her brother while he's sleeping on the couch. The one after that, though, that starts with the shot of his eye twitching to indicate he's dreaming. That then sort of pulls over him and away from Devin's face before turning into an extreme close-up of his eye in the flashbacks timeline, where we see him exit an elevator that has a distinctly different ding than the one we hear when they go into work. It's like that throughout the episode as we move through their memories and travel from his apartment to the testing floor and back. It works really well, and I don't think it's the sort of thing you'd want to see them do all the time, but in this self-contained episode, I never got tired of it. While the scenes with Gemma are measured in hours and days, the flashbacks span at least a few years. After their first meeting, we watch him go to her office after one of their first dates. And what stands out the most is that the things we've heard about her are true. She appears to have a way about her that makes people want to be around her. That and how Mark is truly happy while they're getting together, which just highlights how unhappy and lost his outie's been since we met him. By the time we reach the scene where Devin and Rickon are over, it feels like we've always known everything about this happy couple. The choice to have her reveal her pregnancy to Devin by refusing the drink and then just letting her read her face is enough to justify her feelings for Gemma. And I have to say that it's nice that it's the first time we see Rickon where he's not just there to be the punchline. The scene doesn't need him to be that because it's not about him or his wife. They're just people Gemma knows. Her family and her friends. It's not funny when he says he belayed his first couloir in middle school, but it's more about everyone laughing at the table together than us laughing at what he says. Dichen Lachman just introduces her character and establishes everything we need to know about her in a few minutes of screen time. This is all propped up because we've already heard a lot of these things about her, and then the cinematography, set dressing, and sound design do the rest. I mentioned the colors in the Happier Times montage that's in the middle of this, and the whole thing is a bit soft focus with a film-like quality, which makes it feel dreamy, but the lighting is also worth mentioning. Since it's winter and Mark works at the office most days, most shots we've seen around here in the outie world either take place after dark or are seasonably kind of barren. And everything at the office is fluorescent light hell. With the flashbacks, there's a notable effort to flip that all around. And seeing warm light filling open spaces really emphasizes the divide between where these characters were and where they are. Because we already know it can't last, it's not a big surprise when the spooky transition comes. I don't know what else I would call this because it just feels very David Lynch, which seems fitting enough since we transition from happiness that can't last to the beginning of an agony that doesn't seem to end. It cuts the color and saturation from a close-up of her eyes after she shares her good news with a matching one in a different, darker place. We find out she's in a bathroom having a miscarriage and we see the blood running down her leg. And she breaks down crying after walking into the shower with her clothes on to try to wash it away. Mark unsuspectingly walks in and finds her there, and he goes straight to her. He's just right there with her, holding her and letting the water from the shower and her tears just sort of wash over him. This sets up a cut to something only he would remember if we're taking most of what we see as literal memories. When Ms. Casey came to MDR to observe Helly, a memory that his outie can only access due to reintegration. A sure sign that this episode is doing its job is when you realize we haven't spent any time with most of the main characters. There's a quick shot of Irv's back here, and we never see Dylan or Helly or Helena for that matter at all. The pass through their department is brief and is followed by one of the most involved and built out of the transitions. It goes from a shot of the light overhead into Mark's computer and then follows the wires inside to a brand new area where a 4-person team observes MDR. It's somewhat surreal since each watcher resembles the refiner they're watching. So I guess if you really want to get technical, we do see shots of Helly and Dylan on their screens, even if they're not involved in the episode otherwise. These watchers make you think of the Shadow Twins from the Ortbo, but if you check the credits, they're all played by different actors, so that's not the implication. There's a sped up sequence that flashes screens a little too quickly for you to make them all out, but if you go frame by frame, you can see Mark working his way through finishing the Drainsville file and then starting Cold Harbor. Some screens show all his project names and their progress. There isn't a lot of additional information, but the one thing I noticed was that Drainsville is number 24 on the list and Cold Harbor is number 25. That corresponds to the screen that flashed showing Gemma and Cold Harbor in the season premiere, where there was a line that said ITNO 25 with build in parentheses. As it goes through his 2 last projects, it catches up to the present day, and you notice that Irv's watcher isn't there anymore in the last scene. The room decor resembles the one that he was in with Mark when they did Helly's intake interview, with green carpet and lighting and the square block pattern on the walls. The watchers' desks are turned outward, away from each other, instead of being grouped in the center, and besides that, everything else is a mystery. This is where the Mr. Drummond scenes happen, which lighten the mood because they're funny, and an episode that's this dark really needs that. But they're also the one thing keeping the story connected to the Egans. Drummond asks the doctor, who is wearing a pretty serious wig himself at this point and dressed like a personal trainer or something along those lines, if the severance barriers are holding, which they are, the technology is working. This seems like a reference to the different innies that she has and the way that she's not remembering anything when she leaves the rooms. It's all working as planned. Then Drummond points out that he can tell the doctor likes her as they watch Gemma taken into a room wearing her gym outfit. That cuts to a flashback of her and Mark walking into the fertility clinic that put her on Lumon's radar. When they walk up to the desk, you see the doctor walk by in the background and get what we can presume is his first look at her. You can see a slight shift there. She's worried, but Mark is supportive, and they're facing the uncertainty together at this point, which makes it feel all the worse when you notice the Lumon logo on top of the intake form. The transition here really leans into that because it cuts to her testing floor apartment. I guess they must have repurposed these sets because the layout is exactly the same in the waiting room, so you get this seamless flash from one to the other. This is intimately connected with the Lynch-style transition because this room lacks everything that gives the flashbacks life. Not to diminish the grief that Mark experiences on the outside because they lost the same thing, but seeing her alone here makes her situation feel 1,000 times worse because his isolation is at least partially self-imposed, while she's a prisoner. The shot of her lost in her memories is followed by a sequence of the hallway outside and the elevator. There's an emphasis on lights and vents in the ceiling, which has been recurring through some of the other transitions, and there are shots here from his special wellness session cut in, where he sculpted the tree from her accident. You also see flashes of when he visited that site in season 1 and the dark hallway going from the elevator into the severed floor hallway. I tend to think she had nothing to do with her disappearance, but if there was any evidence to support her involvement, I guess it would be these thoughts about Mark at the crash site, since that would be the negative consequence of her decision. After that, we get a quick flashback where Mark administers her final injection of her fertility treatment. It represents their last bit of hope to conceive, and we'll see her checking a pregnancy test later to show that it doesn't work. One thing that feels minor, but I think might be important for understanding what MDR does and how the rooms are set up, is that she mentions writing him a thank you note. It stood out to me how he immediately responds that she hates writing them, and we'll come back to that when we talk about Allentown. After the shot of her sitting alone, Dr. Mara talks to her as himself outside the testing rooms. He gets a look at her chip using what I think is a fictional device, and it's funny because there was so much blood-related imagery in this episode, I started to wonder if they might be hinting she didn't have a chip at all, that they were using a different process, something involving her blood, so I was glad they added that detail. Their conversation is basically a debrief of her day, and the way they're back and forth plays out kept me guessing at how she ended up there in the first place. The line of questioning is pretty straightforward. At first, he checks her memory about what room she went to, which room made her mouth hurt, and checks to make sure she doesn't remember anything that happened inside or carries anything with her when she wakes up outside. Mark's watcher appears to be watching their conversation, which was weird at first, but then she brings up that there's only one room that she hasn't been in, and that turns out to be Cold Harbor, which has just gotten its name. I guess that would connect things. The biggest question that comes out of this is whether or not she volunteered to be there in the first place. It's hard to imagine, but once Keir gets introduced to the equation, it starts to feel possible, since preying on desperate people is a big part of cult recruitment. That's not to say what she thought she was volunteering for compared to what she got, or to say that she hasn't changed her mind. We see a little of the beginning of her journey in the first flashback where we see them argue. Gemma is showing Mark the card that Dylan stole from O&D to set off the first OTC and talking about her interpretation. This is a test you get in the mail that comes with a survey. And this is also where we hear the name of the episode, Chikhai Bardo, which comes from the Tibetan Book of the Dead and represents the first stage of transition that happens at the moment of death. This is not something I was already familiar with, and I don't think the Googling I've done would do it justice, but this idea of a moment where a person can achieve liberation in the spiritual realm is something we might return to. It comes up in their conversation when she's talking about the cards, and she mentions the man is fighting himself, defeating his psyche to achieve ego death. We don't get more because Mark is put off by the whole thing and wonders where the test came from and why she's wasting time on it. If you look at the survey, you see there's a chance to win a cash prize for completing it. So the biggest takeaway for me is that their recruitment process is pretty well thought out, and that something about the answer she gave moved the process along to the next stage. By this point, you can see that a wedge is forming between them, which would potentially make her more vulnerable. She accuses him of telling her how she's feeling, and when she says she feels beat down, he says they should stop trying to have a child. So the fracture is there, and the next time we see them is in the scene with the crib that I talked about at the beginning. There's really not enough to say where her desperation takes her, or that this isn't a situation where they collected all this information, decided she was the perfect candidate, and then just kidnapped her off the street at some point. To go back to the conversation with the doctor, her follow-up question after she brings up Cold Harbor is what happens once she's been in all the rooms. When he says in Kier speak that she'll see the world again and the world will see her, she asks if that means she'll see Mark as a smile cracks through. He definitely doesn't say yes, and instead steers things towards what she's doing, saying that it's basically bigger than that, and that Kier will take away all his pain, just as Kier has taken away hers. This seems to be as unsatisfying to her as it is to us, and there's a major problem because all we've seen is pain in our time with her on the testing floor. Kier's intervention seemed to happen off screen if it happened at all. There are a couple of other sequences that showcase her loneliness. We see her brushing her teeth and preparing a meal that amounts to boiled tablets in the shape of the Lumon symbol. These tablets have enough color and a carefully placed garnish that they could almost be good if they weren't boiled food tablets. We see another room that involves flying through heavy turbulence with Robbie Benson bouncing around as the flight attendant. For the most part, these are all things people generally don't want to or are afraid of doing. And as I've already mentioned, you could see the marketability. Airlines would all make their planes severance zones. That's a lot of business. As more businesses started to adopt the process, those zones would spread out, there would be more people getting chipped, and you can imagine a scenario where nearly everyone eventually had one. Based on that, the room that stands out to me the most is Allentown, which involves doing something we've already been told that Gemma hated. Sure, the other rooms could be tied to her other fears and dislikes specifically, and you could argue that there are people who don't want to do repetitive tasks at home, but it's weird that this one takes place there. It's a domestic situation that requires her husband to be there rather than taking place in a professional setting. Of course, Dr. Creep makes this much weirder by being there. And I guess the reason I keep going back to it is, in part, because I'm trying to figure out why Mark and his work on Cold Harbor is so important. Obviously, his work with Allentown is what set the stage for that. And speaking of his progress, we get an update that he was stuck at 96% when he got his nose the last time he was in the office. I feel like this episode has been telling us that she's never getting out of there. But Drummond also reminds Dr. Maurer that he'll have to say goodbye to her once Cold Harbor's finished for Kier. The doctor acts like he's prepared to do that, but based on the way he behaved inside Allentown and the way he seemed to very much mean it when he said he loved her, he's gonna have to really rely on his dedication to Kier. She listens to I'll Be Seeing You in her room, the same song that played when Mark was taping her picture back together to reveal that the Miss Casey we knew was really his wife last season. This is cut with the scene with the crib, where they both appear to have reached the end of their respective ropes. The doctor returns for another check-in, and when she asks to go home, he tells her Mark has moved on and is remarried with a daughter, which you know he knows would be particularly painful for her to hear. He keeps going, implying that she may have moved on too in one of the rooms, which helps him reach new heights of creepiness when he was already the most unsettling character they introduced. The cruelty is enough to push her past her breaking point, and the pointed question about her feeling drawn to one room more than the others is more than enough to earn him the Lumon branded chair that probably came out of O&D that she hits him over the head with. She gets away with his security badge, and after a cat and mouse game with the nurse, it feels like she might actually get away. Right until the elevator starts to go up and you hear that ding. Then you realize that she turns into Ms. Casey as soon as she goes to the severance floor. If that's not enough, Mr. Milchek is there to make sure she turns right around and gets back into the elevator. And I don't usually call him this, but that was a milkshake move. There's even a moment where she tries to turn around, which is a reflection of the same thing that happened when he sent her down there last season, and he just shuts her down again. While this is happening, we get the final flashback scene in which we see Gemma getting ready to go out while Mark is busy working on something. He doesn't want to go, and when she says that she could stay, I started to realize this was the night of her accident. On her way out, she says, "I love you." And it almost doesn't register. So it's similar to when the doctor told her Allentown any the same thing and she didn't answer. But Mark catches it in time to say it back and apologize for being distracted. So it ends up being completely different. That turns out to be the only save of the evening, though, because when the elevator makes it back to the testing room, the nurse is waiting for her, and we watch her realize just how trapped she is, and how she'll probably never see her husband again, while we watch the police approach his door to tell him his wife is never coming home. Watching her break down and slump to the floor, and the haunting shot of the darkness obscuring Mark's face after seeing her walk back down the hall towards her room on the testing floor is a lot. Dichen Lachman does this thing with her lip and her nose as she starts to break down that stays with you. And Adam Scott matches that in the closing shot after he finally wakes up. This has come up in several conversations about the chance to see someone you thought you lost for good. The idea of dreams where you think they're still alive only to wake up and have to remember they're gone all over again. He captures that reaction perfectly, but this situation is different. These two might see each other again, and after this episode, that feels like a completely different proposition. Since we experienced the story through Mark's point of view, Gemma functioned more like a ghost than a real character. It was hard to imagine there could be a version that was right there, so close to him, who could still be that same person who existed in those flashbacks. Do we know exactly what Cold Harbor is and how Mark's work makes that possible? Or how Lumon first became interested in her and what happens when she does finish the last room? Not exactly, but there's a lot to sort through. And after watching this episode, I feel more confident that the answers will be satisfying and make sense when they come. There's a lot more to talk about here, and we'll be doing that in the live stream on Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And until then, I think that's a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.